everyone. I know it was quite stimulating to hear about the next generation artificial intelligence and how GRC and analytics are going to be merged. It's a great vision that's really coming from all of your ideas and the thoughts you're provoking for MetricStream as a vendor. So we thank you for that. And we have a panel today to talk about, the implications of all this change and, the evolution of operational risk management. When you think about a field that started, really formally as a discipline in the early 2000s under Basel II. Before that, we'd had regulatory requirements around market and credit risk. But then we've seen just a phenomenal set of changes, in the field of operational risk. So we've brought together a panel of operational risk practitioners, some who have practiced for many years, others who have, found their way in operational risk through the business. But we're going to focus today on, the evolution of operational risk management and how we are adapting to regulatory changes and evolving risk frameworks. And then, including, the business-driven need for more analytics, the need for better reporting, business intelligence. So we'll address all of those issues. But first, I was just going to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves and talk about what they consider some of the biggest change we've had to adapt to as operational risk professionals. So I'll start with Stephen.
Thank you. Good afternoon, I guess.
Morning.
Morning. I'm Stephen Wojcicki. I work for Bank of the West. It's a wholly owned subsidiary of BNPP Paribas. In this space, I am responsible for the client-facing businesses for operational risk. Bank of the West is more of a regional, but bank covering all of the West Coast and mid-states. Our focus is on commercial, consumer, and wealth management business lines. In that space, I have teams in the second line for those businesses as well as governance. I kind of find my way into Bank of the West where I've, through working with some SIFMUs for the last 5 years, but I guess majority of my career has been in foreign national banks, either French or Swiss per se. I kind of evolved from internal audit back in 2004 into the operational risk space, as I've been practicing it ever since. I think to the question that was just raised, I think one of the biggest changes I've seen is the maturity of operational risk management framework and technology, and the expectations of our regulators to be able to demonstrate the sustainability of a program and to be able to piece together an enterprise-wide view of the risk profile for the businesses that you're overseeing on a consistent basis. And I think, in addition to that, the need to have a skill set that not only understands the business but the methodology, and to be able to execute it with the first line are probably some of the biggest things that I've seen in the last 10 years.
Thank you. Joseph?
Yeah, hi. Yeah. Joseph Monks. I work with Market Access, which is a fintech company. And what Market Access does is it's a vendor software system that allows clients to trade bonds over our platform. So think of it like an exchange, like an equities exchange, but this is for bonds. And bonds have historically been, over the counter through phone calls rather than over electronically. This adds liquidity to the market. It's more efficient. Market Access is headquartered in New York, has operations in Europe, Asia, Brazil, and throughout North America. We have sales representatives. As a vendor, to large clients, big banks and asset managers like BlackRock and securities companies, we have all the same requirements as those clients in terms of, vendor risk management, operational risk management, our various audit requirements and things of that nature. As a global company, we have additional pressures from the regulators all around the world, not just the U.S., but also in Europe, MiFID II, FCA requirements, GDPR, things throughout Asia, Singapore, Hong Kong. We're entering into China. Eventually, we'll be getting more into Tokyo. So those types of things. My background before I came to Market Access, I've been working in both risk and audit. Before Market Access, I was the head of operational risk for Citigroup North America, in New York. And then prior to that, I was the chief auditor of Japan for Citigroup for all of its products in Tokyo. I was out in Tokyo for 11 years, which is a great experience. Getting to the point about what are we working on, where's our focus areas, a big focus area for us has been to develop a very strong risk department in terms of operational risk capabilities, as well as defining the 3 lines of defense more clearly as we face off to the regulators and these these strong regulatory requirements. So that's our focus right now. Thanks.
Thank you. Bob?
Hi, good morning. My name is Bob Wertelman. I'm part of TD Bank's U.S. Operational Risk Management team. I lead a team that's accountable as a second line of defense for the ORM programs with our revenue generating businesses, as well as our new and existing product programs and our ORM scenario analysis. My background is varied. I came up through credit risk in the first line and spent a lot of time in specialized lending, as well as syndications in some regional lending departments. I transitioned and spent many years helping build out the U.S. Footprint for enterprise risk management, and then most recently, in the past 3+ years, have been with the operational risk group. TD Bank's a North American bank, so headquartered in Toronto, and the U.S. headquarters out of Cherry Hill, and our footprint runs from Maine to Florida. From a I would say, transition perspective, operational risk for me, it's about going from risk administration, the implementation of programs, and now more about risk intelligence and how we're driving and affecting change within the bank.
Thanks, Bob. So,
my name is Alex Peshesha. I'm with Freddie Mac. For those who don't know what Freddie Mac does, we're in the secondary mortgage market. We provide liquidity in the secondary mortgage market. What that means is that we buy mortgages from banks and mortgage companies so that they can be able to lend to more borrowers. Absolutely love what I do. I love the mission of Freddie. I'm currently in the first line of defense, risk management, while my team provides advisory services to my business partners on the first line. Prior to Freddie, I was in consulting. I was with PwC, E&Y, and Arthur Andersen. The most significant change that I've seen in the last 20 years that I've been doing this is the fact that we now leverage a lot more technology and data to be able to ask the right questions than we did in the past.
Great. So you can see from our panelists, former auditors, former consultants, a variety. So I'm Brenda Boultwood. I'm part of MetricStream's leadership team. I work with our large accounts. I've been here almost 6 years. Before that with Constellation Energy as the Chief Risk Officer. And before that with JP Morgan in various risk and business roles. Before that, Bank One, and really my genesis in the area was in the fields of market and credit risk, and prior to that, even product development when derivatives were new products. So that was a long time ago. I don't want to age myself, but thank you for being here. We're going to address a number of topics and open the floor for questions immediately. Please keep your hands raised. It's a bit hard to see from the stage, but I've asked my panelists for some help, and we'll try to weave your questions in as we go through the discussion. So our first topic was, just how the operational risk management function has evolved from being more of an operational risk administrator. We had Basel requirements. We quickly got into the need to implement one of the first systems around operational risk management. But today, the business is asking us for, kind of risk-based intelligence. So, Bob, I was going to ask you, kind of how you see the function has evolved, and, how is TD Bank using the function to enhance, the business process and the ability to, execute?
Yeah, sure, thanks. So for the past several years at TD, we've been implementing ORM programs, right? And working with the first line, whether it's the process RCSA program or key indicators, loss events, scenario analysis, right? implementing and maturing those programs, but we want to evolve, and we're pushing towards moving from risk administration to risk intelligence, right? So those programs are more, they're always going to be there, but they hit a maturity level at some point, and those are run-the-bank activities. And we see our importance of, how we can change the bank activities, how we can be effective challenge with, how are we using this information to focus our attention, right? So not all of these businesses, risk-based, are created equal. So we're focusing our resources with this information in the areas where there's a higher propensity for operational risk. Are we working with these businesses to challenge their change and their projects and their initiatives in their business? What are we using the information, and how are we using our expertise to work with the business on their strategy and helping inform and helping them think about what risks are out there and what they should be thinking about? And so we've taken a much more proactive approach. It's still evolving, but we are getting very good traction. All of our first line and second line businesses have risk councils that we participate in, and we found that's been a forum to generate it shouldn't just be challenged to be a partnership, right? So being seen as a subject matter expertise stakeholder and helping them be seen as a risk partner, not just in administration, but in how they are driving their change the bank initiatives.
Okay, so Bob, just building on that, the requirements for operational risk were, collecting risk event data, doing risk assessments, using metrics, and also scenario analysis. And I know in the beginning days, we focused on just capturing those data points, and often capturing them in silos. So can you talk about how some of the manual work around the types of data that operational risk managers, use, how are you shifting the mindset from manual to more automated and perhaps integrated?
Well, so the manual to automated is a tougher question to ask. I'll start with the integrated, because we're still working on the automated part. So one of the things, we have, lots of information, but, what are we doing with it, and who are we showing it to, right, and how are we elevating it? So last year we started a concept, we call it business risk profiles. It's an ORM independent assessment of the risk profile of each of our businesses and control groups. That we author, but we do in partnership with each of those businesses, using the data that we're pulling together from all of these programs. That is then presented at our operational risk management committee, so in front of our business and risk executives for information sharing, for challenge. It's also provided us a better picture of, so it basically, it shows what are we doing with this information, what's it telling us. It also allows us to step back and say, okay, now that we've done this across our dozen or so groups that we've done it with, not all these groups' risk profiles are created equal. So when we look at this holistically across our platform, where should we be focusing our time? Where should we be spending more of our attention to? Where should our challenge be more vigorous?
Mm-hmm. Any comments from any other panelists as you think about that evolution from more of an admin to kind of a more dynamic data manager?
So you're beginning to see a lot more predictive analytics being used. So for example, at Freddie, what we do is that we have a lot of data. We can tell if there's an uptick of foreclosures in a particular region. That way we're able to ask the right questions. In the past, that hasn't been the case. One of the things that came out from 2008 crash is we had all this data as a company, but we were not able to predict some of the things that came out. So we're doing a lot more predictive analytics to ask the right questions.
So Alex, it sounds like you might be using also external data, just macroeconomic indicators, regional indicators, to help you, think about where the next defaults might be, for example.
Correct, yeah. So it's a combination of what we have internally as well as external data.
Okay, great. Any other comments from panelists?
I think part of it is having the ability to collate the data properly. And for our firm, and as Bob was mentioning, we're on a journey too, because we, some firms have built their GRC systems and their technology and their methodologies by second line groups. Compliance did something, internal audit did something, risk management did something, enterprise risk management something. So the ability to collate and integrate that data properly and to interpret it in a timely way to turn around to make it meaningful is something that Bank of the West is working on, but it's a journey.
Right.
Because to take all of those pieces from different systems into warehouse and to turn around to interpret it and to make it usable to executive management is not an easy task, because it's multiple systems to try to bring it all together.
Right, right. Okay, great. So, there's been quite a bit of evolution. And then, Alex, we wanted to talk about, kind of the evolution just in the roles of people as well. We've spent, time in this conference talking about what's happened across the three lines of defense. And so can you talk about what you've seen as the evolution of the three lines of defense and the impact that's having on your operational risk management function, Freddie?
So about 20 years ago, the view was mostly from Basel. We'll talk about people, process, technology, and external events. There's a lot of evolution that has happened from that from the four categories, and I believe my company has about 10 different categories: people, process, technology, third-party risk, model, governance. There's a lot more that has happened in terms of moving the level 2 risks into level 1 to give them a little bit more scrutiny than they have in the past. Cyber is one of the key risks that we're facing as a company, and I think raising that as part of a profile makes sense.
So Alex, you talked earlier as you were introducing yourself about being part of a first-line operational risk management function. So can you talk a little bit about the difference between the roles and responsibilities of a first-line ORM professional and the ORM group that exists in the second line?
So as a first-line risk management group, what we do is that we provide risk management support for business partners. That means that we are sort of embedded within the team. It's 1.5. It provides us a little bit more opportunity to provide advisory services compared to second line and third line. I've spent time in second line and third line, but there's always that independence that you have to hold onto to make sure that at least you're independent enough not to advise, then come and audit the same thing that you're advising for.
Mm-hmm. So how do you contrast that with what the second line operational risk management function is doing?
Yes. In my company, second line comes up with the policies, and they make sure they provide effective challenge for the policies that they implement. First line risk management, we make sure that we're in compliance with the policies that have been implemented by the second line.
Perfect. Okay. Any comments? Is that the same at Market Access or at Bank of the West?
Yeah, I just make a few comments that, I mentioned earlier, I worked at Citigroup before, and I think it's a good example because, they operate 140 countries and, they're doing everything around the world. And at Citigroup, they have risk groups in the first line, which are business risk groups that are identified. And they also have, the second line, they have even what they call independent risk management. Mm-hmm. And I think the key is that they all collaborate, number one. Number two, I think within the front lines, it's more about, being proactive, intraday activities, like for a trading floor type activity, monitoring positions, understanding what's going on, product control, things like that. And in the second line, it tends to be a little bit, stepping back a little bit more market risk, that type of thing, and credit risk. And then the third line does not own a process, but they have oversight, and it's a little bit different than audit in that it's very specific to risk areas. Mm-hmm. And often they have aligned to the board of directors as well. And in my current role at Market Access, we have a decentralized second line of defense right now. I'm the third line, both risk and audit, and we're working on the separation of these three lines and having a more robust, second line defense, which will own processes like credit risk, operational risk, things of that nature. So I see the difference with owning the processes versus the independent line.
Yep. Any other comment?
Yeah, I think for Bank of the West, we're probably our second year into splitting operational risk from the first line and second line. So in 2017, senior management decided that first line needed an advisory function. So they've created first line risk managers, and we separate ourselves as far as executing everything to handing that over. But I think to Alex's point, the first line is really there for advisory to the business on the execution and the ownership of the risks. Second line is for methodology, advisory, training, and credible challenge. And that's kind of how we've separated ourselves. Now, having said that, that's not the exact model for other institutions. That's just what we've decided makes sense for our organization.
Right. So even across this panel, we're seeing very wide variation. Alex talked about, kind of a 1.5 line of defense. Joseph talked about being, an operational risk, but actually in the third line. And, just in terms of evolution, we could say like pre-financial crisis, just after the financial crisis, the second line was not only, creating the framework, the policy, system requirements, if there was a system, but they were also the doers, actually often performing the risk assessment. I think all that's really gotten clarified over the last few years, and now, more and more responsibility in the first line of defense to, perform the risk assessment, identify and capture the risk events, near misses. And second line, I think to your points, Alex and Stephen, it's really, it's framework, policy, system requirements, and then challenge, right? And not to be provocative, but we're talking to large banks that are talking about, continuing to thin the second line of defense. And then with more automation in the third line of defense, that becoming more of a thin ribbon, if you will, and virtually disappearing. So, not in fact, but, just if we've set up all the automated control testing, if we've, and they become much more of an advisory function. So more dramatic changes are expected, in the structure and responsibilities of the second and third line, with the first line, kind of gaining the responsibility, the benefit, I guess, of being closest to the risk and assessing and but that creates responsibilities, right? So we'll talk about that in a minute. So Joseph, I was just going to ask you about there have been new regulatory requirements. So we talked about Basel II in the early 2000s, but you're looking at reg requirements around GDPR, RTS 7 in the UK, different things that are creating a burden, more responsibilities for the operational risk function. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure, yeah. We find that, globally, regulators, generally they converge and they have similar, themes, but it's both, principles-based and rules-based. And my experience, like in Tokyo with Citigroup, I use that a lot for what I do at Market Access as it relates to it, because working in Tokyo with a company that's headquartered in the U.S., it's regulated by every regulator in the world. And so you have to have both the U.S. regulations compliance as well as the Japanese regulation compliance and other countries that you're working with within Asia. True for market access as well, being that we're global in all those locations. So a key point for us is let's have a model that works globally. As I mentioned earlier, we started off, we're a relatively young company, 15 years old, public about 5 years ago. And so we started off with a risk function which made sense. We didn't have a formal audit function. We created that formal audit function last year. We further made it more robust this year. And so we come up with the decision to separate, audit from risk, because it gives the optics that potentially audit is impaired if it's run by one individual covering both, audit and risk. So we want to make it very clear we have a third line defense audit function. So that's what we're doing. But related to the regulations, we're embedding requirements. RTS 7 is like RCSA in the US. It's a risk assessment requirement. So we're embedding that into our capabilities within the risk function, as I mentioned, developing that second line of defense risk function more centrally, which is now decentralized. And then we're also adding things like GDPR with vendor risk management and other capabilities that we have rolled out in the risk function. The benefit I have is I'm running both, which is kind of special, but I've done both. But so I have a say in how this is going to be structured and set up. But I really do think they all complement each other. I have a strong view when I worked in audit and before risk with Citi in New York that risk and audit are very related in many respects. You have to understand the risks to do good audits. You have continuous audit monitoring, risk assessments, things of that nature. And I think it's very important, to embed these requirements, like I said, in your risk and audit areas in terms of MiFID II, AML requirements, all that type of work. And so we're getting out in front of it and being really, careful about that, working closely with compliance. The other point I just want to make, what was stated earlier, when you don't have these functions well defined, you'll find that decentralized groups will step in and sort of, try to cover the function because it's a gap. And so, for example, compliance will step in and they'll become more of a process owner rather than advisory. And I think, the risk department is in a special, circumstance to be able to connect things enterprise-wide rather than having things siloed. And that's where I see the benefit of risk in doing that. I also have I'm a big fan of audit, and that it's sort of the third line of defense is the one that always comes in, tests things, finds things that people don't know. It's the things you don't know that concern you, right? So everyone goes after the topical issues, which are in the FT and the Wall Street Journal, cybersecurity, whatever it is, this kind of thing, data breach, and things you see on TV. Okay, let's do that. BCP. Well, how about doing a deep dive test in something which is considered to be low risk, and then you find out it's a problem that's been going on for the last 10 years, and it's an issue to us. So I think it's important to cover everything, holistically, in a comprehensive audit plan. But to answer the question, all the regulatory requirements are embedded in our risk and audit functions.
Right. But I think your point about, kind of embedding, in the risk framework, these reg requirements, and we mentioned RTS 7, there's also BCBS 239.
Yeah.
We talked about GDPR and the data privacy requirements, into the operational risk framework, so that, whether it's reporting or, data privacy, that there's a framework that's guiding, how the business process is evolving.
Yeah.
But I think you're right, you do have to avoid places where, like we see in many places, many organizations where, for example, market conduct and MiFID, compliance almost becomes the owner of some of those requirements, and that becomes...
Let me just make one other comment. It's just that in establishing the risk function, both at Market Access and what I did at Citigroup, I found it very useful to look at OCC literature. There's a lot of really good literature around, the capital requirements back in, 2016, that period of time, which I recommend that you take a look at. There's things like, BIF report, where they talk about, business environment controls, and various things where you can set up a very thorough operational risk program and set up scenario analysis. I sit on our boards, and our board is very interested in scenario analysis, where we look at, external events as well as potential internal events that we think through, whether it be, I mentioned earlier, cybersecurity, BCP, growth in our business, operational, controls that we need around for the growth of our business, for settlements risk, credit risk, and give some examples of those scenario analyses at a very detailed level. And then, just think through, okay, what would be the potential loss for us, and what is our capital against that loss? And what are we doing in terms of reviewing these kinds of controls through both risk and audit? So I'd recommend you look at that OCC literature back in 2016. Thomas Curry, came out with a lot of literature. It's on their site. And Mandar Simone over here, this gentleman, is working with me on scenario analysis and doing a great job for us. So it's really important for us, very topical.
Yeah. I think also the FFIEC guidance from the OCC on third-party management, for example, was a breakthrough as well.
Yeah.
So, good point. Okay, so any other comments about, kind of embedding reg requirements as they emerge in our operational risk framework?
I think this has become standard practice, right?
Yeah.
I think the expectation is that when something's issued and something comes out, that your institution should be looking at it, right, and making sure how you align yourself to it. Defining what the roles and responsibilities are between the three lines of defense for whatever that regulation is. And I think more and more, as something comes out, you have to take a proactive approach, how it impacts your institution, where does it sit amongst the three lines of defense, and then who owns it?
So Bob, you're saying really ORM is raising their hand and saying, taking the leadership role in that, but by necessity farming it out.
But I think for us it's been more of a bank culture, right?
Yeah.
And so that collectively, not just ORM. So something might come out that we have accountability and ownership for, and then we have to drive that and implement that. Or it could be something in compliance or fraud or cybersecurity. So I think at TD, we've implemented a culture of proactive approach to regulatory, whether it's a change or just comments or initiative, or frankly, sometimes when something goes wrong, right? A hiccup at one bank is the problem for everybody else now. So, when something happens at one institution of a high magnitude, it's ultimately within a 12-month period, it's an exam for everybody.
Well, it's called the Wells Fargo exam, right?
Right.
Not to name names, but it's kept many busy, right?
Yeah.
Any other comment on the?
I think because the nature of our industry now, and because of the continuous monitoring that our applicable regulators apply to us, it's almost it's not forced us, but it's become almost consistent, at least in my institution, where you need to be proactive.
Mm-hmm.
You need to be in front of it versus your back foot, because you don't want to be slammed in an exam for not being aligned properly. So I think it's part of our culture on a consistent basis now.
Great. Okay. So we were going to turn to Alex and talk. Going back to the theme of the evolution of the risk management framework. Alex, if you could comment on, where did Basel start? Where are we today? Does it keep expanding, or are we reprioritizing as we go through time? What do you think?
So like Joseph mentioned about the topical items that keep coming, cybersecurity is one of them, privacy is another one, fraud is another one. We're moving towards, from people, process, technology, and external events towards having some of those level 2 risks become level 1 because people want to talk about them a little bit more. So I foresee that increasing as more topical items come up. But I believe in about 5 years, it's going to be about 10.
Yep.
What that means is people, process, technology, third-party fraud, model. I foresee landing to about 10.
Any other comments on? Is it going to expand beyond 10? Will it be 20 in 5 years, or will it?
You probably need to balance with when everything's important, nothing is, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
That's right.
I think we've gravitated towards. I think we started with 7 or 8 key risk, major categories, and we've in recent years have added, like say a capital adequacy, right? As CCAR became more prominent in your capital, and then model risk out of CCAR, model risk emerged, right? Because the importance of models in your risk identification testing. So, that I think from institutionally, right, that puts more focus on those areas. Collectively, I think the bank gets around that, and you get more, you appropriately resource against that. But you have to always balance with as you don't want to dilute the attention to what's key, right, and most important.
Right. Any other comments?
We try to break it down into key operational risk categories, as you guys have indicated. And from our point of view as a fintech company, technology is always at the top of the list, because we have this platform. We don't want outages. That would not be good for reputational risks, different reasons. We're heavily regulated around that with the SEC. There's a dependency on us to keep this platform running and going, just like any exchange. Mm-hmm. So that's key for us. That's BCP type risks, cybersecurity risks. Also, operational risk is really huge, and that relates to, like I said before, Thomas Curry has statements around that after the banks became more capitalized, and the key that operational risk is a key prominent risk in the industry. And I generally agree with that, and I think it's a big bucket. It's a lot of areas, but I think that's an area where we're getting some leverage, and I'll put in a little commercial for MetricStream with our GRC platform to bring in all the materials together and connect the dots and help us do a better job on issues management, remediation, tracking, and other tools that we see coming out of that data in terms of IA and machine learning and things of that nature.
Right. And just to build on Alex's comment, like it might be the board of directors, it could be executive management, but sometimes there are just themes they want to talk about. It might be Brexit, it could be Trump, like issues, that they want to talk about. So what we're seeing is a requirement that, on the one hand, you want to maintain perhaps a hierarchical risk library where you have your categories and then the specific names of risks with their definitions, but also set up separately, maybe you call it top risks or key risks. But often they're just combinations of the underlying risk taxonomy categories that you have. And so being able to do that mapping so that you can pull the information that's been identified already internally, but then group it in a theme called Brexit or whatever risk topic, data privacy has become very important in the press. But again, kind of the system can help enable that type of flexibility, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
and I think another key point there, and I think many are aware of this, but there's a desire by the board to be more predictive, right? And to have identify the categories as you mentioned, do scenario analysis, and then having leading, KRIs, key, indicators. And it was talked about in some of the other seminars here, through this machine learning, do correlations and determine predictive elements so that if there's let's say there's a loss incident that happened, what caused it, go backwards, and then try to figure that out and figure out the correlation between the variables and use that as a predictive measure for future instances.
Good. So related to the theme of, kind of those categories of risk, I was going to ask Bob about, okay, so we've changed, as Alex said, we've grown from 4 risk categories, so maybe there are 10 that are most important and form the basis of our dialogue, but why do we bother? Like, what's important about, focusing on the right categories of risk?
I think, it draws attention to, first of all, building out. So every one of our risk categories now, there's a major risk category. We've built out policy frameworks and programs around it and governance. It helps identify, I think, first, second, what is the role between the first and second line? I think often when risks emerge to the forefront, where maybe they've always been there and they've taken on a prominent role. So it could be, say, cybersecurity is a great example in the past couple of years. I'm sure many institutions may be still trying to define what is the cutoff in the role between the first and second line in that way. And so I think it helps drive where the accountability lies and what the roles and responsibilities are. And then I think just from an information perspective, right, like it's, you have a lot more information you need to data and collect, and I think that becomes another challenge, right, for your bank, right? How do you pull that all together?
Right. Okay, great. And then, Stephen, related to that is, do you think, as we've added additional categories to focus on, it might be cybersecurity, it could be, the OCC guidance has led us to a focus on third parties. What do you think that's doing to the function? We've talked earlier in our prep discussions about, more integrated approach to risk management, or ERM, right?
As these new risk categories have come up at institutions over the last few years, as Bob has mentioned, institutions and financial services are building frameworks around them in order to help manage that effectively in that respective space. But the key for an integrated approach, whether it's operational risk or first-line risk, is to have an overarching shared view as far as methodology that's consistent across, let's say, the second-line functions. A lot of times what we've seen, at least in Bank of the West over the last 5 or 10 years, has been where, compliance has their framework, fraud has their framework, BCP has their framework, operational risk has their framework, but they don't talk to one another.
Right.
Which is a challenge for our institution, and we're making headway, and we're going down that path to resolve that. But one of the stumbling blocks for us was we didn't have something at an enterprise level that was strong enough to say, as you're building out these new frameworks, these are the principles that are shared across the firm that are consistent. So what we found ourselves doing is partnering with the first line to break down those silos and start developing some consistency, not only from responsibility, but methodology, definitions, and now hopefully an integrated model. But depending on where a firm starts, will dictate where you are now and how far it's going to take in order to get there.
So can you give us just some hints on methodology? What's important that we get right in terms of creating that consistency?
I think from a methodology, it could be something simple as definitions. What's the definition of quality assurance versus quality control? Having a consistent set of definitions is a very simple one. Having a consistent risk scoring methodology that can be used, this is a challenge for us as well. But having an approach, whether it's inherent and residual risk versus likelihood, or and then can you use that consistently in measuring, let's say, self-identified risks versus risk assessment versus BCP versus vendor management. That's a challenge because sometimes firms may have 3 or 4 different scoring methodologies, and you have 3 or 4 different scoring results, and you try to plug that all into one formula to come out with an aggregated view as far as how well the business is doing managing the risk. It's very difficult.
It's hard when red doesn't mean red.
Right. So if you have the buy-in from senior management and the backing of, let's say, your chief risk officer and your chief compliance officer, I think chances are, as long as the buy-in with internal audit, it'll probably help immensely to get to where you need to be.
Great. So simple things like definitions, as you say. What do we call these risks? Right. How are they defined? And then you talked about the scoring methodology, especially like the impact scale. What does it mean to be high rated, low rated? Get agreement on that. And then we're also finding companies focused on what is an issue, and it seems so simple to talk about an issue, but is an issue the same if it's arising from a third-party risk assessment as an issue arising, from an operational risk assessment or a self-identified management issue, right? And do they all get reported to the board? Do they all have the same, level of importance, right, in terms of aggregation?
Exactly. And the last thing to add, and I think we're all faced that in different spaces, is if you have those things right, it's how do you bring that all together? We're challenged because we have several GRC tools at the same time, and then our parent wants us to change that, which is good into an integrated model, but it takes some time and it takes a lot of effort from the top all the way to the bottom in order to make that happen.
That's right. That's right. So we continue to scan for questions. We'll look around. We have a question. Great. Do we have a microphone? Okay, Marteza's back there. Great. So if you can wait 1 second, it's on its way.
Thanks. Hi. Adam Greenstone, Agency Counsel for Ethics at NASA. So I think the risk scholars would often classify legal and related reputational risk as a subset of operational risk. I'm curious if you all have any thoughts, lessons learned, experiences, reflections on how the legal function in an organization is integrated into the operational risk framework.
So in my company, it's separate from operational risk framework. So legal is looked at slightly different from the other operational risk categories.
So I would echo that, like legal is separate from operational risk. There are components of the operational risk framework that legal may participate in from a program and execution perspective, but in terms of it's not embedded or doesn't roll up through operational risk, whether it's from a organizational structure perspective or whether it's from just how we define our major risk categories And that would also be the same for reputation. We reference reputational risk. So reputational risk is a standalone major risk category within TD Bank and is treated as such. So that while ORM might help administer some of the reputational risk oversight, such as a rep risk committee, it is a standalone.
Yeah, in the case of market access, legal is separate, but it's separate from ORM, but it's an advisory function. And I definitely consult with them on regulatory risks. And there's various projects that they give us advice on, like GDPR, MiFID II, different things of that nature, things in the US with requirements. And then we do track regulatory risks within the ORM function. I do that, the risk group, based on our discussions with them and our agreements on what we think makes sense in terms of the risk categories of these areas. So we do dimension it and work with them, but they are advisory. They're not a part of ORM directly. They do sit on the board risk committee. There's our general counsel, although I'm the one who chairs the meeting and I lead it, but they're there just to answer some questions on advisory matters.
So, Stephen, any comment?
No,
on legal?
I think it's similar to what Bob mentioned. Legal is considered a corporate function, similar to HR per se. They're both accountable to execute the operational risk framework. Probably from an end-to-end perspective, maybe less in legal. And then from a reputational risk, we use that as part of our risk assessment process and evaluation of the businesses and their controls.
Okay, so some differences. I can speak. There are a few large banks that are integrating kind of legal and compliance into that overall integrated risk management approach. But definitely the legal team, like the HR team, and other groups are kind of required to use the same vocabulary, Stephen, that you were talking about. If they're performing risk assessments, they're using the same impact scales and kind of participating in the tools like other groups. But but so it sounds like it varies quite a bit. Good, but great question. So I believe we're getting close to our time limit here. But before we end, I say 5 minutes. I'd like to do kind of a round to talk about what's changing, new, and kind of evolving in terms of analytics. Right? It's certainly been a theme throughout this conference, but perhaps a quick lightning round, if you will. We'll start with Alex, if it's okay. Just what you're seeing in the analytics area, and what do you think risk management has to do to get ready for all this?
So I think with the use of predictive analytics and different types of analytics, we're beginning to see the need for data scientists. I think that's one of the biggest categories for people looking for employment, will be being a data scientist. So I foresee that continuing to grow. As you mentioned, there's a possible thinning of a second line as well as a third line, as they focus on more strategic risks and push all the risks to the first line to be able to manage the risk themselves.
Yeah. Bob?
So I think there's an opportunity, at least I'll speak for our bank, an opportunity from an issues management perspective to bring it all together throughout the bank and then use a predictive artificial intelligence type application to help us spot trends. We're a large institution, things happen throughout the bank we might not have full visibility into. So there could be some trends going on in a couple different spectrums of the organization that we're not picking up. And so I think the ability to collectively bring all this information together and then from a predictive AI tool perspective, look for trends and point us in perhaps from an emerging risk perspective.
Oh, great. So, it could be natural language processing, which we talked about this morning, or other AI techniques to help us identify what's emerging through the big data we're receiving, structured data. Interesting. Joseph, what are you seeing? I know you attended a AI conference recently for fintechs.
AI is very large for our company. As a fintech company, we're seeing AI in all lines of defense, including the first line, new product offerings that have machine learning. And we have our platform that gets updated every 6 weeks. The SDLC process, adding more quality assurance using that methodology, and even, like I said, products that are released. And I think for risk and audit, there's opportunities to better manage data, be more predictive on KRIs, be more comprehensive in the audit reviews that we do somewhat seamlessly by using more automated tools and AI. And the other comment that's a key one for me that we're watching. But the other one I would mention too is I really think that, theoretically we all say that the first line are risk managers as well as the second line and the third. The first line, of course, is very focused on, making money and sales, and that's what we want them to do. And we've been at different programs, we talked about, having the right incentives, bonuses, and things like that, which don't seem to get much traction because probably the first line doesn't prefer to do that. So I do see a lot of, requirements hitting the second line risk group more and more. And I see that as really a key group that's bringing together these sort of siloed, decentralized departments enterprise-wide and taking on more responsibilities that are somewhat 1.5 related. So it feels that way that the risk group is really taking on a lot more ownership.
Right. Stephen?
So I think for AI, I think harnessing that information to drive more forward-looking metrics for your businesses as far as risk measurement, and in addition, to be able to have your second line be able to understand that information and the connectivity of it in order to be able to use it from an advisory capacity, I think are two big things for us.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be limited to AI. We talked earlier, just common statistical techniques. We're now in a place where, because we've got an integrated risk management framework, we have data on third parties, we have, some legal information, we have HR information, and a lot of business information. Can we use statistical techniques like correlation analysis to find out, when an event may have been lagging, control test failures, or when metrics exceed violation, are we likely to see an event, right? But using the data we have, as imperfect as it is, to start exploring, whether it's statistical techniques or natural language processing. We talked a little bit yesterday about robotics, around, very manual processes, and then artificial intelligence, where we can either give the machine some rules and have them apply the rules, or some combination where the machine smartly determines new rules over time based on the data. So it's an exciting frontier, and maybe the next panel where we meet, we'll talk about all the skill sets we need to deploy that, or maybe you're working now with your teams to successfully evolve them. But any other quick question, as we end the panel? No? Okay, well, thank you very much for your time. We have 6 seconds left, and want to thank again our panelists.